In May 1945, the guns fell silent. Yet for millions of German soldiers, the war did not end. Whole armies surrendered at once, and Allied lines buckled under the flood. Their fate depended on who captured them. Some entered organized Western camps. Others were driven east into years of harsh labor. Many expected release within weeks, not a decade. On 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered, and the Allies suddenly became responsible for more than 11 million German POWs, surrendering in waves from Italy to Denmark and across Germany itself. Many soldiers raced west to avoid Soviet capture, but camps and capture points were already strained. Feeding, housing, and processing so many men at once became a post-war emergency in itself. The United States created a temporary status, disarmed enemy forces to manage masses held in open-air enclosures, rather than formal POW camps because the usual system could not absorb them. Vast holding areas like the Rhine Meadows camps appeared almost overnight. Shortages of food shelter and medical supplies reflected not policy alone, but the chaos and logistics collapse of the first months. Britain faced similar overcrowding in Northwest Europe, where tens of thousands surrendered daily. Capture points were overwhelmed, and temporary facilities in Belgium and the Netherlands expanded rapidly to contain the flow. Soon, prisoners were transported to camps in the United Kingdom itself. Camp 165, Watton Eden Camp, Kultiebragen, where authorities prioritized registration security screening and orderly movement, turning chaos into administration. For those captured by the Soviet Union, the story followed a harsher path. By the end of 1945, Soviet forces held more than 3 million German soldiers. Many were marched to collection points in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, then shipped deep into the Soviet interior. The journeys were long, conditions hard, and mortality higher than in Western captivity. Soviet authorities treated POW labor as part of reparations, shaping rations, housing, and work assignments. This policy framework echoed in archives and memoirs, defined daily life for years after the fighting stopped. By late 1945, Western camps stabilized. Emergency wire enclosures and tents gave way to regular shelters. Food distribution normalized, and medical care became routine as the immediate crisis eased. In the Soviet zone, conditions varied, yet most prisoners moved quickly into labor. Across all zones, 1945's priority was simple: restore order. First, then pursue denazification and investigations later. By late 1945, the numbers made one fact unavoidable: the Allies needed labor. Ruined cities, broken railways, and desperate civilians pushed governments to turn captivity into workforce for reconstruction. In the West, the 1929 Geneva Convention allowed POW labor under regulation, and American, British, and French authorities built work programs. In the Soviet Union, prisoners were framed as reparations instead. Soviet-held Germans were sent to mining in the Donbass and Urals timber in Siberia, repairs in Magnitogorsk, and construction in major cities. Camps like Vorkuta-Karaganda and Rybinsk became hubs. Conditions depended on region command and supply lines. Illness, thin rations, and brutal winters raised the cost of survival, though archival records suggest gradual improvement after 1947 as priorities and provisioning shifted. In France, German POWs became a pillar of recovery. About 740,000 men worked between 1945 and 1947 rebuilding bridges, factories, ports like Brest and Le Havre, and laboring in mines and farms. French records indicate POW labor sometimes supplied more than half the workforce on major projects, even as long hours and rough conditions fed resentment and fueled debates about how long prisoners should be kept. Britain used POW labor mainly in agriculture. By 1946, over 400,000 Germans lived in British-run camps, harvesting crops, clearing bomb sites, repairing drainage, and working forestry across England, Scotland, and Wales. Payment was symbolic as the Geneva Rules allowed, but many prisoners remembered this stage as steadier than the first chaotic months. Local communities learned camp names and saw prisoners daily. Smaller contingents worked elsewhere. Belgium in coal mines and public works, Canada in farming and logging until releases sped up in 1946, and Czechoslovakia in domestic rebuilding after devastation. Across the Allies, the same tension grew. Reconstruction demanded hands, but politics demanded repatriation. By 1948, debates hardened over how quickly to send prisoners home while major projects still depended on them. For millions, the war had ended, yet compulsory labor shaped every day. Europe's roads, bridges, farms, and factories rose again through their work, often far from the families they hoped to see. As labor expanded, another task ran in parallel, sorting ordinary soldiers from those tied to crimes. Screening began in May 1945 and drew on precedents set at Nuremberg. In U.S. and British zones, POWs filled questionnaires on politics, SS links, and security roles. Denazification categories ranged from major offenders to exonerated and most eventually fell into the lower release-eligible groups. Thousands faced deeper investigation. Intelligence teams like the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps interviewed selected prisoners searching for Gestapo or SD members and for men connected to atrocities in occupied territories. In American and British captivity, daily life gradually normalized after the first months. Mail arrived via the Red Cross sports teams, formed language classes appeared, and prisoners even produced camp newspapers. Re-education grew in 1946, especially in Britain, emphasizing democratic values, current affairs, and modern history. Participation was voluntary, yet thousands enrolled, treating the classroom as a bridge back to civilian life. French camps varied widely. Some prisoners worked long reconstruction shifts with little organized life, while others lived more settled routines, receiving clergy visits and Red Cross inspections as food and shelter slowly improved. A minority in France were transferred to courts for suspected offenses often tied to occupation policies or collaborationist authorities. For most, however, the waiting and uncertainty mattered more than the formal legal process. In the Soviet system, ideological instruction ran alongside labor. Anti-fascist committees pushed renunciation of Nazism and political education documented in camp records, though many prisoners experienced it as compulsory. Hardship remained constant: food shortages, disease, and severe winters shaped by local administration and supply. Memoirs from Soviet-held POWs repeatedly describe these pressures, even as mortality declined after the worst year. Across all zones, morale was battered by uncertainty. Men waited months or years without clear timelines. Rumors spread of sudden transfers or releases, and families searched through Red Cross tracing services for any confirmation. Yet small communities formed inside the wire. Prisoners marked Christmas and Easter with improvised ceremonies, organized choirs, kept diaries, and sometimes built friendships with local civilians, especially in rural Britain and France. By 1946, many German POWs believed release was near. In the Western zones, that was partly true as the United States faced domestic pressure and shrinking labor needs. Then began mass repatriations. Many returnees passed through Friedland, the reception camp in the British zone that became Germany's main gateway home. By early 1947, most remaining U.S.-held prisoners were transferred or sent back directly. Britain moved slower because agriculture and rebuilding still depended on POW labor. German prisoners remained crucial through the 1947 harvest, and repatriation accelerated only after a phased release program was announced. By December 1948, most German POWs in Britain were home, yet several thousand stayed voluntarily as civilian workers. Many married locally found stable jobs and chose not to return to a shattered Germany. France followed a similar timeline, but with sharper tension. Reconstruction targets led authorities to delay releases until U.S. pressure and public debate shifted policy in 1947 and 1948, pushing repatriation faster. By 1949, nearly all POWs in France had returned to Germany, with a small number remaining to complete voluntary contracts. The labor they provided had rebuilt mines, ports, and public works across the country. In the Soviet Union, repatriation was slowest. In 1946, more than 2 million Germans were still dispersed across hundreds of camps, and although mortality fell after 1945, food and medical care remained uneven. Releases began in late 1947 but stayed limited. Larger transports followed in 1948 and 1949, yet thousands, especially men convicted of war crimes in Soviet courts, remained imprisoned for years longer. The final chapter opened in 1955, a decade after surrender. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow in September, negotiating for the last major group of prisoners still held by the Soviets. Soviet leaders agreed to free the remaining men, including many convicted in Soviet courts. In October 1955, trains arrived at Friedland, and thousands of families gathered, turning the platform into a national memory. The returnees stepped into a transformed country, divided into East and West. Each state framed POW experiences differently. West as reintegration and recovery, East as anti-fascist re-education, shaping public narratives for decades. Many underwent additional denazification hearings, often symbolic by the early 1950s. Yet reintegration was difficult. Some struggled with families and careers after forced labor, while others preserved diaries and memoirs as lasting sources. By 1956, the POW era was effectively over. Millions had returned, but captivity had stretched far beyond the battlefield, leaving one of the longest shadows of the Second World War.